Hello and welcome to another episode of the Oxford Conservatives podcast, where we shall today, ironically, sitting here in the Oxford in the city, be discussing the wondrous topic that is the countryside. I'm Archibald Elliott and I'm joined here by Mr. Joshua Yen. How are you doing, Joshua?
I'm doing splendidly. How are you, Archibald?
I'm also doing splendidly, yes. It's nice to be back, and it's a good sunny day here.
Indeed.
In the city, which is, I suppose, rather a shock, considering the recent weather, at least.
Exactly. Do you think this is properly classified as a city, Oxford? I come from Hong Kong, and comparatively, Oxford would not even count as a city; it would be an outskirts, a small town, perhaps.
A village.
A village, indeed.
Yes, a little hamlet. I suppose if you look around Oxford, you don't exactly look out of your window and see great, luscious fields. We do have areas of meadows, I suppose, and they're instituted by the colleges. So it's a bit of an odd city, I would say. But it's certainly not the countryside. You could class it as a town, perhaps, but it's certainly urban. And I think we could make this distinction between an urban and even countryside divide. You have it in the countryside itself. The town is different than the country, even if it is just a small market town. And there was, at least traditionally, there was much more of a divide there between the town and those from the country. You have townies and country folk. And then it's interesting if we compare that to then the large urban centres, you have London, Birmingham, Manchester, all these large cities in the UK. And there's even a larger divide there. I think that's what would be very interesting to discuss, this sense, have we become too urban? You saw a lot of the out movement, especially the Industrial Revolution started it, and then more in recent years there's been even more of an outpouring and importing into London. And in some cases you've had an outpouring of the metropolitan elite back into the countryside, which we'll come on to in a bit. But do you think there's a problem in this urbanisation?
I do think there are certain questions that can arise from us being too urban. First of all, does it mean that we're no longer valuing jobs which are perhaps considered more tied to the countryside? Farmers, for example, maybe shepherds or whatnot. I'm not exactly sure what goes on in the countryside. I'm a city boy myself. But you think about fishermen, these jobs. Well, oftentimes when people look at their career in the world today, especially in first world countries, you see people like, oh, I want to be a lawyer, I want to work in corporate. But why do people do that? Is it because they want to make more money? Is it because they want to seem to have this idea of prestige? Or is it just this kind of a priori disposition towards these big firms in the big cities? I think that the emphasis on such jobs is perhaps one of the negatives which come to the fact that we've become too urban, is precisely because we no longer value certain lifestyles and certain decisions that people are making.
Yes. I think it might be especially so if we're considering the current big wars, especially in the UK. We describe it as war in war sense, but there's a big campaign against farmers to some extent, even across Europe. It's happening. A good example is in Wales, where the farmers were told, if you want to keep on receiving these subsidies from the government, you must rewild 20% of your land and not use it no longer for farming. And considering the already very tight margins on farming and the need for subsidies, it really is much like putting a gun to their head and saying, accept this or your business will fail. And there's been massive protests against it, with farmers going down to I can't for the life of me pronounce the Welsh Government. I do apologise if you're Welsh and listening to this. I shan't try to butcher it. To protest that, they've been going in big tractors into London. And especially if you go into France, I mean, they certainly know how to do a protest. I'm not saying I condone the techniques they use, but they haul these massive, I'm not sure if you've seen the videos, they haul these massive trucks of manure wheeled from tractors, and they spray them into government buildings. And there was one very unfortunate case where the government building, the window was left slightly open, and all of this manure was sprayed into the building, and it went into the building and was piling up. And I must say, I thankfully don't like the French very much, being very British patriot. Obviously, we have our camaraderie, they're French and we're British, so we're destined to hate each other. But it was rather funny. And I think it displays a rather large point, that there's a disconnect now between those in the city and those in the countryside, in terms of perhaps food production, in terms of the role it's played and the role it has to play. Otherwise, if we go into the shops, we won't see any food there to eat. I wonder what you think of that divide. Do you see a disconnect? I mean, from the city, so perhaps. But you're a good fisherman, so I hear. So perhaps you see that disconnect more than others.
That's true. I do believe there is a massive disconnect. I think people who don't experience the countryside, have grown up in a city all their life, just don't know exactly where their food comes from. They look at perhaps the vegetables they're eating, they look at the meat they're eating. The only conception they have of such produce is from the Instagram reels, excuse me, that they see of perhaps an animal getting killed or some plants being grown, and you see those Instagram time lapses of someone taking a video of a plant slowly growing from in like 3 seconds from like a tiny plant to like a whole plant, and you're like, well, we love plants like these, but well, there's more nuance to it. Growing vegetables is a difficult thing. You go to a farm, you have to grow vegetables, you have to fight against pests, you have to fight against certain land animals that might be interacting with your farm, and they might be eating your things, and you have to kill them, stuff like that. But people don't really understand these things because all you see is just a concrete jungle, perhaps, if you're in a big city like London, Hong Kong, New York. And as a result, you have this detachment. I think that detachment's a very dangerous thing, because you then start taking things for granted. You don't appreciate the actual effort which goes into really trying to have a good agricultural understanding of the world, because that's a very difficult thing, to be able to properly irrigate your vegetables, to properly understand what seasons you grow vegetables. People don't know that. People don't appreciate that. And that leads people not to have that empathy for farmers, empathy for certain people who do need support, I think. And also it would tie into our discussion on veganism later. It makes us kind of take the value of food for granted, to take vegetables for granted, animals for granted, perhaps.
Yes. And I think there's also this perhaps danger of idealising the countryside, especially through these TikTok videos. It shows the nice side of life, but there's a lot of hard graft that goes in that I think is not recognised. That it's not necessarily just all fun and happy. We see lambs here in the fields, and we all smile and we have a wonderful jolly time. There's the other side of it, where it's inordinately tough. There's so much you have to do, and if it rains for 7 days and your crop's ruined, is your livelihood gone? It's so dependent on the earth and interdependent there. And there's no wonder in this country, especially considering the pressures we put on, that farmers have an very sad, very high suicide rate, and of leaving farming. And it's just a terrible shame. I don't think there's an appreciation of what they do, and indeed what our country needs. If we turn back to perhaps even times of COVID, or even the war in the Ukraine, or perhaps further abroad, when our supply lines are disrupted, and we think, well, there's no. I live on an island, for example, so when our boats don't go, there's very little food in the shelves, apart from the food we produce on island, and I think we need to recognise that more and produce more, but it becomes increasingly harder because the margins simply aren't there. And it's interesting you talk about this disconnect of where people don't know where their food comes from. And I think it's gotten to sometimes a worse case in the 1960s, when they took children from the inner cities into the countryside, and they were amazed to see a cow. I think there's still people now who'd be amazed to see a cow. They might see the pictures of them, but don't quite realise what an amazing creature it is. And in that sense, they become much more squeamish in some sense, where they're perfectly happy to go on their shelves and see perhaps packets of steak, or perhaps they see some weird processed meat like Spam, and see that as what meat is, and not realise where it's come from. And they get awfully distraught when they hear that this thing's had to be killed, and they're probably happy to eat it, but they're not happy to kill it. And I think that's therefore a very large problem. And you're a fisherman yourself, so I think you'll.
Yes, I do think tying into the veganism debate, I suppose, and perhaps we'll return to veganism in more depth later on in the series if you're interested. Let us know in the comments below. But I do think there is something very special about interacting with animals, not only in the sense of, oh, I love them, I'm feeding them, but also killing them, because all of life processes is a movement of hunting, it's a movement of development, it's a movement of creation, but also destruction. And to say we could only create without destroying would be a real shame about reality. And I don't mean destructive in a negative sense, but I think there's a positive way about destruction as well. I mean, in Hindu religion, destruction is a god in some sense, as Shiva destroying the world, and that kind of destruction leads to further renewal. And of course, we're not Hindus here. I hope that is rather obvious, but nonetheless, I think that cycle of life that you interact with by going into the countryside, by going fishing, you catch a fish, you struggle to find a fish to catch, then you kill it, humanely, you dispatch of it, you eat it, you cook it. You appreciate that game of hunting and evading, which is so vital to daily existence, not only in the countryside, but in life in general. We have goals, we try to achieve it, we pursue it, we finish the goal, and then we go back to set another goal for ourselves. And in the same way in the countryside, the farmers, they try to grow an animal, they try to grow a cow, they kill it. Of course, some of us say, oh, that's horrible, that's bloody, but that's how life works. I mean, an animal kills another animal in the savannas.
Yes.
A lion hunts antelope. So I think, in fact, if we want to be pro-nature, we have to not be vegan. In fact, we have to engage with this beautiful balance of life and death, which is found throughout the world in the animal kingdom and beyond. And we have to take part in it and really appreciate and give it the proper gravity and respect that it deserves, of course, but to recognize its importance and value. I was wondering what you think about that.
Yes. But I also think it comes with this disconnect. If one's disconnected from one's food production, one doesn't realise what goes into it, and one doesn't like the perhaps not so palatable bits. But I'd agree they are entirely palatable, and it comes with this cycle of life. And perhaps living too much in cities, I wonder if there has been research done on it. I've not checked the papers myself, as to if it has made us more vegan to some extent. We didn't used to be a phenomena of this very large vegan movement. And now they have some of the metropolitan elite who go into the countryside and complain at all the horrid practices that happen there. And it's such a great shame, because they should just go, if they go into the countryside, they should embrace the culture. It's much like we see in immigration, where if I moved over to France, I wouldn't expect to just live like I was in England. Actually, I should live in England and France. Bad example. But if I was to go over to Germany, I'd live with the German culture. You live with the culture of the place you're in. Now, perhaps it's a bit too extreme because I could never be German. But you can certainly embrace the culture fully. And in some sense, that's where we've had the war against hunting, where I'm not sure if you're too aware of it in this country, where we banned most of the blood sports. So there's no actual fox hunting anymore. There's no beagling. They've removed it. They banned it. It was originally, I think, fox hunting was seen against the upper class. They called it a cruel sport. But there's nothing really cruel about a quick blow on the head to a fox where it's instant death. And it helps cull the natural predators in the population that wreak havoc across the great swathes of the countryside. So wreak havoc against the chickens. And especially there's one very interesting case that for some reason people are awfully het up about. They really they're really annoyed about it. It's when you go and kill a badger. Not that I endorse killing badgers, because it is illegal in this country to kill a badger. Not that I have killed a badger, I haven't. But they wreak havoc with TB. I don't even know, I don't think we have badgers for that sake. But they wreak havoc with TB on bovine stock, on your cows, and so on. And you can't remove, you can't disturb their sets, because they're protected. I think that's roughly the right of the law. And it wreaks havoc against every farmer, because once you have TB in your flock, in your herd, you can then not produce milk until it goes free, and it kills many animals and it ruins livelihoods. But you can't do anything about it, because somewhere in the bureaucracy has decided, oh no, let's protect our badgers, and their populations are welcome to flourish, and it destroys at a great cost the farmers and the production we hold so dear. And I think there's this disconnect between those who campaign for certain things and the recognition of what actually are the implications of what they're campaigning against.
I completely agree with that, and I think there is a real shame where you have, as you say, this disconnect between the people who are implementing the policy and the policies, what the policy affects, and this ties into, of course, as you say, farming, agricultural policy, hunting, but also it ties into every political realm. A lot of times politicians are sending other people to do the dirty work for them, to suffer the consequences of things they know absolutely nothing about. And perhaps we can kind of tie this onto more of a political divide between the countryside and big cities. I was wondering what you think about this seemingly growing trend about the countryside being a bit more conservative in some sense, compared to big cities being a bit more left-wing. I was wondering whether perhaps it would suggest that this divide between conservatives and liberals might not only tie in to the idea of, there's a certain set of propositional values that I agree or disagree with, but rather it's very much more of an attitude towards life in general. If you have perhaps a harder life, and I don't mean harder as in, oh, I don't have as many kind of issues to deal with, but rather it's a more physical, demanding kind of existence, fight for one's existence, you're naturally predisposed to be more conservative. You recognize certain values more than if life is perhaps easier. You go home, you're in a nice bed, everything's given to you, everything's kind of afforded to you. You naturally say, oh, we could do whatever we want, because there isn't really I would say there's a strong disconnect not only to the roots of things, but also a disconnect to consequences. Because if there's a famine, we could be like, oh, well, there's a famine, but we don't actually acutely feel the dangers of the famine. We're like, well, okay, maybe the food prices go up, but okay, I'll just pay for it. Whereas for the actual farmers, people in the countryside, they get affected directly by the famine, and they struggle from it. So I was wondering whether that kind of psychoanalysis, perhaps, of that divide between the countryside and the big cities is a valuable one, and is whether it's a correct one.
I think it's also important to note the perhaps discussion in values. Not in conservative values is not necessarily, we're not talking about economics. I think that's something which I'm quite happy for the time being to put outside of any discussion of politics. I think the social values is what we need to discuss, and indeed almost the spirit of the nation, to not put it into German. I think that's what needs to be discussed in form of the conservative sphere. Because for too often we've linked it to being low tax, this and that. And no, we should have low tax. I don't disagree with that. But we've linked conservatism to an entirely large set of liberal ideas. So if we see a vast swathe of the party today, in the Conservative Party in the UK, of which I'm supporting less and less, there's a large sect which are economically liberal and socially liberal. And I always want to ask them, I do ask them, what makes you conservative? Because you're liberal in both senses of both axes on the political charts. You're liberal. There's no, it was almost a modicum of conservative sense. Unless we just find conservative being pragmatic, but then that becomes its debate in itself. So I think in this sense there must be a desire for more tradition of ways of doing things, of having more value of family, having more value of honesty and pragmatism, and standing up for what you believe is right in one's nation, and so on. And I think we do see that in the country. And perhaps there is indeed more freedom, because you think, well, if it's my land, I should be able to fence where I like, I should be able to build the outbuildings I want to build, be able to put trespassers off my land from damaging my stock, be able to hunt what I view as a pest. Perhaps there is more freedom in that too. And it's interesting when you look at the map of the electoral divide in this country, and you see the map, and you see a lot of blue, and then you see these red centres, and the red centres happen in the cities, and the blue happens in the countryside. And again, it's not a great, it's not a dividing line. You do have other cases, but I remember looking at a map of the last election, the election before that, or it might have been 2010 election or something between then and now. And I saw these blue, and I thought, well, how can the Conservatives don't have more of a majority? They cover most of the landmass, and it turns out it's the population density, and in cities they seem to vote more left-wing. And I wonder if it comes into the point where there was some EDI office somewhere. I think it might have been advising the National Gallery or something. And it was saying that paintings such as Constable and Turner, beautiful paintings of the British countryside, which are absolutely sublime, would radicalise us. There's an interesting article in Spectator about would really taking the British train journey through the countryside radicalise us. I think, well, the British train won't, but the countryside would. Its innate beauty apparently gives rise to radicalising us to the far-right nationalists. And I wonder why, because it's something so beautiful to protect, and I discourage and scourge the idea it's far-right. It's simply nationalist, and that's a good thing. And we look out across the countryside, and we see these lovely rolling hills. We see, indeed, almost the epitome of the hymn Jerusalem. And it's simply beautiful. And I think it awakens something within within our own spirit, that says we should protect this, we should preserve this, and makes us indeed nationalists. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it does radicalise us to some extent, but radicalise us back to how our humans naturally are. We're not made for the cities, we're made for the countryside, we're made for the outdoors. We're made for doing great and marvellous things.
There's a few things I want to touch upon there. Firstly, I do agree with you. Nationalism can be seen as a result of embracement of the beauty of one's land, and I think that land is best seen in the countryside, because you look at a city, they're very similar. You go to Hong Kong, You go to London, you go to New York City. They're very similar. There's nothing which makes a city a city in some sense. You just see tall buildings and whatnot. Of course, with Hong Kong, I would say Hong Kong is perhaps the purest form of a city, purely because it's geographically located in the middle of a harbor. So I think kind of geographically that makes Hong Kong what it is. It makes it unique. But you look at Manhattan versus London,
Singapore.
Or Singapore, they look very much similar. They're just tall buildings, and that's basically it. But if you think about kind of the countryside, that makes it stand out. The rolling hills of London's very of the United Kingdom is very different from the country parks of Hong Kong. It's very different from, I suppose, the national parks of America, Yosemite and whatnot. So you do notice that the identity of a country ties to the countryside more than it does a big and developed city. And more important than that, I think you have this aspect of well, the protection, the sublimity of the countryside, the nature in itself makes us feel the beauty of the sublime. It radicalizes us, not in the sense of, oh, we are forcing a political view upon us, because nature, the world, the countryside, these things are not political in essence. You don't look at a tree and you're like, oh, that's a conservative tree, or that's a liberal tree, or that's going to vote for Trump, and that's going to vote for Biden.
You mean trees don't vote?
Yes, I was very surprised by that. I asked a tree once and it didn't reply to me, but...
But did you not know they can send in mail-in ballots for the 2020 election?
Ah, yes, of course they could, especially
That's what they did. Yeah.
Yes, especially if they look like a coffin, but in some sense, it's not a political notion. The countryside, it's a non-political notion. It's just beauty itself, and if beauty rises within us a spirit which makes us move towards a certain direction, I would say I'll be all for it. In fact, we should follow the lines of beauty because it can bring us very far. Now, I do wonder what you would think about perhaps the causes, the reasons for why the left kind of dislike the countryside, or what do you think is the motives behind this distaste?
Well, I'll come first to your question about architecture and then on to the left in countryside. But I think the reason the cities all look the same. I saw an interesting thesis the other day it was down to the invention of air conditioning. Because before, all these cities had to design their buildings in such a way that it would keep it cool in summer or warm in winter, and it would result in all these differences in architectural styles, because there's no way to regulate it. So in Northern Europe, you'd have to have smaller windows, or you'd have the smaller windows in hot countries as well, but designed in a certain way to be nice and warm. And then you'd have places in India or in China that would design their buildings in certain ways to provide, again, a certain cooling in summer and so on. And I think it comes into an interesting, particular interest of mine, I think that in China the translation might come to sky windows. This is the idea of an atrium pool. And even this courtyard style building, where you build around separate courtyards and the family all lives together, that's slightly different. But even in just the construction of the buildings, were so varied in all the traditional buildings of the world, because there was a purpose and a requirement for them to be built in a certain way. And I suppose if you again now look to now, they can all be built in a similar way, because the technology allows them to put a house in Hong Kong, or perhaps not Hong Kong is a bad example, a house in Hong Kong might be rather rare to find, but a house in somewhere in the Midwest and somewhere in northern England, and they can look almost very identical. You look at the skyscrapers of Hong Kong, of New York, of London, and they all started to look similar again. And I'd say it's awfully dull. It loses this sense of cultural identity, in the sense that you are in a different place, that you are a different peoples. And I think it homogenizes us to try to think the same and try to globalize us, as we talked about in globalization. And I'm sure we'll come on to another episode in this series about architecture itself. It's a fascinating topic indeed. But onto this why the left wished to subjugate. I think it's because they ultimately want to control. If we see the Soviet Union, they did subjugate the countryside. They made the farmers produce so much wheat that they would be left with nothing themselves. And they wish to collectivise, because I think if you have a farm, you own vast swathes of land. You have land as power, after all. I'm not entirely sure why they wish to subjugate it. One would think they should embrace the farming, the way of life. But there is something inextricable about it, that they're vegans to some extent. I think they're out of touch with the countryside, and they view it as something antiquated that holds these old values that they wish to replace and wish to be nice and clean and new. And socialism, I think, doesn't really like private enterprise. where your farmer works for himself. He chooses what crop he wants to grow, and he works hard, and he can reap the rewards. Or in this country, I think they should be well subsidised farming, because it is the production of our food, especially given our lack of currency pegging. I think it's much more important to have these subsidies in place. But I'm not sure, would you have an idea of why they wish to see the demise of this traditional way of life?
I very much agree with what you're saying, and someone would have to grow the farms. It would have to be a farmer, regardless of whether you like it. Maybe the farmers in the West, maybe the farmers in the East, wherever he is, right? Maybe not in his country, they would have to be somewhere. But the conclusion of that is that they need to be somewhere in the world. And the problem is, if it's not done in your own country, it'll be done somewhere else. And then the left would just be like, all right, we've made our country a leftist state, but then we're still buying stuff from other countries, which is just as right-wing, or if not even more, in their own terminology, even more right-wing, because, well, we've radicalized that country by making them farm for us. So I do think it's somewhat internally inconsistent in that.
The left wing, I suppose, if we look back, the left wing used to be more free trade, and the Conservatives more protectionist. If you look back to at least the 1920s and the Conservative Party here, and I think it's important to be protectionist of one's own industry, of producing our own steel, of producing our own cars, of our own food, and having that self-sufficiency as a nation. I think it grows and bonds us more together, because every part of society therefore matters. We don't have to send it off to someone in a far away country and be desensitized from the product. We can see it being produced. We can see the supply chain in action, and it makes us feel, I think, more connected to the way of life. And I think the countryside provides that connection. It provides that tranquility. And not just tranquility, it is hard work. And we shouldn't idealise it. It is something tough, but it is equally, at the same time, absolutely beautiful. And I think that finishes our discussion here on the countryside. I do hope you've enjoyed. Do like, subscribe, share, and comment, as I suppose the YouTubers say. Yes, and join us again for our next episode. God bless.
God bless.